Have you ever wondered why some of the brightest men on the planet, with budgets that would make entire nations tremble, agreed to put human beings inside metal traps that were more likely to explode on their own than to complete a mission? The story we are told about the Cold War is full of heroes and cutting-edge technology, but the truth lies hidden backstage. It's much darker, more controversial, and frankly, counterintuitive to any logical mind. Today, we're going to shatter the belief that military might has always been synonymous with excellence and delve into a paradox where billion-dollar innovation has only served to create the fastest coffins in history. Get ready to discover the secrets from an era where the incompetence it was masked by medals, and where the survival it was a daily miracle for those who dared to defy gravity in these doomed machines. By the end of this account, you will not only understand the mechanics of these malfunctions, but you will receive a valuable reward: the ability to identify the signs of a failure imminent in any project of your life before the first screw is tightened. Looking at the sky during the peak of Cold War was not an exercise in admiration, but in constant tactical apprehension about what the incompetence humanity was capable of mass production. The mindset that governed the upper echelons ignored the fact that strategy prioritizing speed over structural integrity has transformed hangars into anterooms to cemeteries, where the glare-armored flaws in the fuselages concealed fatal miscalculations. What was seen at that time was a desperate race to break the sound barrier, a decision of policy that trampled over any basic safety protocol in the name of air supremacy that often only existed on paper or in doctored reports for high-ranking officials. It's the same self-destructive logic as someone trying to accelerate a race car on an ice track without proper tires. The initial boost is impressive, but the outcome is invariably a violent and predictable failure. Backstage within the military-industrial complex, what truly dictated the rules was the fear of falling one step behind the enemy, which created an environment where the survival and performance of the pilots was treated as a disposable statistical variable. That's the big secret which official propaganda of the time tried to downplay with heroic images. We were piloting flying laboratories that should never have left the prototype stage, machines where the cost of each screw was valued more than a human life, veteran who knew the system's flaws by the sound of the engine. For those who want to understand the gravity of this, just analyze the concept of planned obsolescence applied to war machines. It's like investing in an asset that you know will break down, but you hope it will last only long enough for the next official photo. If you want to study this mentality of managing through fear, reading Machiavelli's The Prince offers a glimpse into how power prefers immediate effectiveness to lasting security. This frantic pursuit of air superiority created engineering monstrosities that defied not only the enemy, but the logic of elementary physics with each takeoff under pressure. The weight of knowing that each command on the control stick could be the last, not because of an enemy missile, but because of a poorly placed rivet, brought brutal clarity to the real priorities of those in power. Living this reality meant understanding that the imposing aesthetics of a jet were merely the shell of a systemic error, an illusion of power that crumbled at the slightest sign of real mechanical stress at high altitudes. The lesson learned is that uncontrolled force is merely an invitation to disaster, and this lesson was written in the blood of many who believed in promises of infallible technology. It was in this scenario of uncertainties and dangerous innovations that one of the most bizarre and ironically self-destructive machines the Navy has ever seen. The bitterest irony in naval aviation occurred when engineering finally managed to outrun death, only to stumble over its own shadow during the Cold War. The Grumman F-11 Tiger was an elegant machine, with aerodynamics that strictly followed the area rule. But this pursuit of supersonic perfection concealed an incompetent ballistics that defied logic.
It was the Navy's first fighter capable of maintaining absurd speeds in level flight, but nobody predicted that firing projectiles forward could result in a rear-end impact, turning the pilot into a target for himself. It's the ultimate example of when technology advances so fast that it ends up making a complete loop and hitting its own creator, a miscalculation that no veteran forgets when talking about poorly planned projects.
Us backstage. From Grumman, the enthusiasm for design, armored, and the wasp waist aesthetic prevented engineers from seeing the obvious. Ballistics doesn't forgive a lack of synchronization with the physics of high speeds. In 1956, the world witnessed the impossible when a Tiger tank fired its cannons and, while diving to accelerate, encountered its own 20mm burst mid-flight. A secret. This shameful situation marred the careers of many engineers. For those seeking a practical lesson on risk anticipation, this case is like an investor who focuses so much on the immediate profit of a stock that they forget to read the liquidity clauses. You think you're making progress, but you're only creating the scenario for your own downfall, failure. Financial, I recommend a detailed analysis of the concept of systems engineering to understand how an error in a single variable can collapse a multi-million-dollar project. A decision to keep the Tiger in service, even knowing it was a suicidal aircraft, shows how much more important the image of power was than the reality, survival. The reality was on an aircraft carrier. Seeing that machine quickly eclipsed by more robust fighters was a relief for many, as flying something with a history of one-on-one combat against itself didn't inspire confidence in anyone. The lesson that speed without proper systems integration is just an invitation to disaster was etched on the fuselage of every unit that survived that experimental phase. This kind of grotesque failure was just the beginning, because if the Americans were shooting themselves in the foot, the Soviets were about to take pilot negligence to a whole new and terrifying level. The philosophy behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War treated the pilot not as a combatant, but as a disposable extension of a ground-based radar system. And the Sukhoi Su-9 was physical proof of that. Incompetence, doctrinal. This aircraft was designed under a strategy, a rigid system, where centralized control from Moscow dictated every move, transforming the cockpit into a metal prison where individual initiative was seen as treason. The result was a jet that, although fast and visually appealing, was almost impossible to fly in real stress situations, with an accident rate that was treated as a secret, a state tactic to avoid tarnishing the regime's image. It's like a company trying to manage every single micro-task of its employees through rigid software. Productivity dies on the altar of excessive control, and the system ends up collapsing under its own technical bureaucracy. In Soviet air defense, the Su-9 was nicknamed the Tiger's Embrace because any minor command error resulted in a failure, catastrophic and irreversible for whoever was at the controls. The weaponry was another bad joke. Missiles that required the pilot to keep the nose of the plane pointed at the target at all times, ignoring the fact that, in the real world, the enemy has the terrible habit of maneuvering to secure their own survival. For those who want to understand how the wrong focus can destroy a goal, imagine an investor who puts all their capital into a single cryptocurrency without an emergency exit strategy. You become trapped in the asset's trajectory, unable to react when the market turns against you. If you want to study the danger of extreme rigidity, reading about Nokia's fall in the smartphone market is a perfect modern analogy for the lack of tactical adaptation that the Su-9 represented. Each decision, the engineering approach taken by Sukhoi at the time, seemed to ignore the scars of each veteran who was trying to tame that wild, unbridled horse in the Siberian skies. The aircraft had such a high landing speed that touching down was less a technical procedure and more a desperate gamble against death on each poorly lit icy runway.
The feeling of powerlessness in operating a system that didn't trust their judgment was what truly eroded the morale of those on the front lines of the Soviet defense. This disregard for human life and combat ergonomics created a chasm between the propaganda of strength and the reality of fragility that would only be surpassed by even more scandalous disasters on Western soil. What happened in California shortly afterward would prove that lack of control was not a privilege exclusive to the Soviets. American technological arrogance during the Cold War reached a tragicomic level in 1956 when the F-89 Scorpion transformed a simple interception mission into a trail of destruction across California. Its strategy was based on brute force. If you don't have the precision to shoot down an enemy drone, fire hundreds of unguided rockets and hope that probability does the dirty work. What occurred in the skies over Palmdale was a public display of incompetence, a glaring technical blunder where two fighter jets fired over 200 projectiles and managed to miss every single one, proving that volume of fire will never compensate for a lack of tactical intelligence. It's the same lesson as trying to solve a complex management problem by simply injecting more money without changing the flawed structure. You only increase the scale of the problem, failure, and the collateral damage all around. What the backstage, the Air Force tried to hide it under the cloak of secret. The military incident was the absolute chaos generated by rockets that, instead of hitting their target, started forest fires and damaged the homes of innocent civilians. Decision, the reliance on automatic systems that failed at critical moments, forced pilots to aim by eye, without manual sights, transforming a jet, armored, into a blind and dangerous artillery platform for the very population it should protect. For those seeking to understand the importance of redundancy and control, imagine an home automation system that malfunctions and locks you out of your own house. The technology that should serve you becomes your biggest obstacle. I recommend studying Failure Mode and Effects Analysis, FMEA, to understand how the lack of a Plan B can transform a routine operation into a public relations and security disaster. The feeling of veteran watching the Scorpion operate gave the impression that we were betting on survival. The nation's defenses were based on machines that were veritable white elephants, heavy and incapable of agile maneuvers. The outcome of that incident, where the drone only crashed because it ran out of fuel and not due to fighter jet action, was the final blow to the credibility of certain defense concepts of the time. Seeing the official solution being an upgrade to rockets with nuclear warheads under the logic of, if we don't hit it, we'll blow up the whole area, shows the level of desperation and lack of ethics that governed the period. This mentality of doubling down on failure paved the way for even more claustrophobic and bizarre projects that would cross the Atlantic. What the British were designing in the de Havilland hangars would take the concept of the flying trap to a level of discomfort that few could imagine. British engineering has always had a touch of eccentricity, but in the case of the Sea Vixen, this characteristic crossed the line into incompetence. The ergonomics designed became a sentence of isolation for the crew. The jet featured an asymmetrical cockpit where the pilot sat on the left, while the radar observer was buried alive on the right in a windowless compartment nicknamed the coal hole. Strategy completely ignored the psychology of survival in combat. It forced a man to blindly trust another's maneuvers without the slightest visual reference to the horizon or imminent danger. It's like trying to manage a company where the finance department is locked in a room without access to market data or the CEO's vision. This isolation creates a mismatch that in times of crisis leads the business straight to ruin. Operational. What the backstage from de Havilland, the focus was purely technical. The radar needed total darkness for the screens of the time to be legible, a decision which sacrificed the humanity of the operator for the sake of limited technology.
The result was a terrifying accident rate, where the secret, what was best kept secret, was the silent panic of men dying without knowing which way the plane was turning. For a practical analogy on the importance of transparency, consider an investment system where you entrust your capital to a black box algorithm without any follow-up reports. The lack of visibility prevents you from getting out before impact. Studying the concept of human factors in engineering, HFE, is essential to understand how the Sea Vixen became a case study of what should never be done in a high-stress environment.
Each veteran, the person who worked in that metallic cave, carried the weight of knowing that they were the first to die in case of structural failure, since ejection was a slow and often impossible process in that cubicle. The feeling of being armored, the perceived safety of the metal fuselage was an illusion, as true in-flight protection comes from situational awareness, something that was stolen from the observer in exchange for a radar that often didn't even work. Seeing far superior aircraft, such as the F-4 Phantom, emerge soon after, only underscored how anachronistic and dangerous the Sea Vixen was. The disaster was systemic, and this lack of integrated vision regarding how man interacts with machine was about to reach its peak in an American jet that promised to be the future, but ended up being known only for its chronic instability. The haste in responding to the threat of Soviet bombers during the Cold War led Convair to deliver a design that initially was incapable of fulfilling its basic promise to break the sound barrier in level flight. Strategy using a delta wing seemed revolutionary, but the incompetence in predicting transonic drag, the F-102 turned into a blunt dagger trapped in an invisible barrier of aerodynamic drag. It was a shocking moment for us behind the scenes at the Pentagon, where billions of dollars seemed destined for failure because the engineers ignored fundamental laws of physics that were still being written. It's like launching an innovative product on the market without testing whether it actually works under real load. You spend your entire marketing budget on something that in practice doesn't deliver the main benefit promised to the customer. The great secret, the solution to saving the project, came from the discovery of the area rule. A decision, a last-minute technical maneuver, forced a complete redesign of the fuselage, giving the jet that Coca-Cola bottle appearance to reduce drag. Without this intervention, the F-102 would have been just another piece of junk armored in the airbase yards, unable to reach the targets it should intercept to ensure the survival of American cities. To understand the importance of pivoting a strategy at the right time, think of an investor who realizes that their business model is obsolete and has the courage to change the company's structure before total bankruptcy. I recommend reading Blue Ocean Strategy because the F-102 only survived when it left the common design zone and embraced a radical and unexpected solution for the time. Despite the redesign, the feeling of any veteran, the opinion of those who piloted the Delta Dagger, was that the aircraft was always operating at the limit of its capacity, with little margin for error for defensive maneuvers. The aircraft was a stopgap solution, a luxurious stopgap that would soon be replaced by more powerful versions, but the cost of its transition left scars on the trust between pilots and designers. Seeing the colossal effort required to fix a basic aerodynamic flaw served as a warning about how technical arrogance can blind even the greatest geniuses of aviation. This lesson that form should follow function and not the other way around would be tragically ignored again in the next project, which would conquer the world as a star but end its journey as a widowmaker. The Lockheed F-104 was the embodiment of a dangerous desire for pure speed, a metal spear that cut through the sky of Cold War with the same aggressiveness with which he destroyed the confidence of whoever was piloting him. The idea behind this project was to transform a man into a human projectile, but incompetence in balancing this performance with basic stability resulted in a jet that forgave zero errors.
For a veteran, the starfighter wasn't an aircraft. It was a high-risk gamble where survival depended more on luck than technique, given its wings as thin as razor blades, which barely generated lift at low speeds. It's like betting all your assets on a single, extremely volatile market option. The acceleration is exciting, but the risk of a crash is failure total and instantaneous, is present in every second of the operation. Behind the scenes at Lockheed, the secret, even more sinister, was the bizarre solution found for the emergency system, an ejection seat that fired downwards under the justification that the pilot would hit the tail if he ejected over the top. Engineering officials ignored the reality that most problems occurred during landing or takeoff, turning a rescue attempt into a fatal impact with the ground. For those seeking to understand how a lack of systemic vision can kill, consider a manager who cuts safety costs to increase productivity. Profits rise in the short term, but the human cost ultimately breaks the institution. Studying the concept of user-centered design is fundamental to understanding how the F-102 became the greatest example of ergonomic neglect in military history, earning the nickname "Flying Coffin" in several air forces.
To see that cigar armored tearing across the horizon was a visual spectacle that concealed an unacceptable accident rate, with nations like Germany losing almost a third of their fleet in peacetime. The lesson for every man who donned a flight suit at that time was that technical beauty should never override the integrity of life, an ethic that was sacrificed on the altar of supersonic performance. The political pressure and bribery scandals to sell this machine to other countries only heightened the feeling that we were operating under a deadly charade. This trail of widows and wreckage left a vacuum of confidence that other projects attempted to fill, but the British rush not to be left behind generated an equally unstable and hasty response. The decline of a glorious lineage is rarely sudden, and in the case of Supermarine, the Swift was a painful symbol of one, failure born from the rush to convert past glories into relevance in the Cold War. It was dangerous, taking the basic structure of first-generation jets and pulling the wings back, hoping that this technical makeshift solution would be enough to face the Soviet MiGs. The result was an aircraft with an incompetent, terrifying handling, where the nose had a tendency to rise violently and flip the plane at certain speeds, a nightmare for anyone. A veteran expected the precision of a Spitfire. It's like a traditional company trying to digitize its processes overnight without training its team or adjusting its infrastructure. The facade looks modern, but the internal engine collapses under the new market pressure. What was whispered in the backstage, the Air Ministry's claim was that the Swift had become a shameful secret, a project consuming astronomical budgets while pilots died in routine tests. Decisions forcing the machine into service before resolving airflow problems at the engine intake sealed its fate, causing flame outages every time the cannons fired. For those seeking to understand the risk of skipping steps, imagine launching complex financial software without a rigorous beta testing phase. The first critical error not only breaks the system, but destroys the brand's reputation forever. I recommend reading The Logic of the Black Swan by Nassim Taleb to understand how ignoring improbable but catastrophic events can lead to the total ruin of projects that seemed solid on paper. The feeling of seeing Swift retired in less than a year was one of relief, mixed with the sadness of losing a legend armored, because history is tarnished by mediocre and hasty management. A survival, the Supermarine's career as a fighter manufacturer came to an end there, proving that in the world of high technology, you are only as good as your last functional design, not as good as your past medals. That machine was a warning that transitional engineering requires more than just courage. It requires a technical humility that was ignored in favor of political deadlines impossible to meet. This pattern of ignoring safety in favor of radical concepts was not unique to Britain, and across the ocean, the US Navy was about to put on deck one of the most visually impressive and mechanically dangerous fighters ever built. The Vought F-7U Cutlass looked like a vision of the future brought to the Cold War, but for those on deck, he was the embodiment of a failure of technological tool that defied fate with every landing.
Vought's approach was radical, a tailless design with swept-back wings inspired by research captured from the Germans, but the incompetence of Vought to provide even minimally reliable engines transformed this futuristic beauty into a constant risk. The jet was so undersized that pilots said the Westinghouse engines generated less heat than a lighter, making the survival on takeoffs with maximum load an exercise in blind faith and nerves of steel. It's like a startup that invests everything in an award-winning interface design but forgets to build a server capable of handling basic traffic. The appearance is captivating, but the actual operation is an impending disaster. In the US Navy's backstage, the Cutlass was known for a secret terrible. Its nose landing gear was so high and fragile that it often collapsed under the stress of carrier landings, throwing the nose of the aircraft against the pilot's cockpit. Decisions maintaining such an unstable center of gravity was what sealed the fate of many boys who saw metal armored of their cabins turning into fire traps after a slightly rougher touch on deck. To understand the gravity of ignoring the structural basis of a project, think of an investor who focuses only on the high dividend of a company with unpayable debts. The collapse is only a matter of time and an external variable beyond control. Studying the concepts of material fatigue and impact dynamics is crucial to understanding why the Cutlass was one of the biggest misjudgments in the American naval industry. The feeling of a veteran seeing the Cutlass retired was like surviving a game of Russian roulette where the weapon failed in his favor. That machine, nicknamed Fighting Rooster, ended up being a wounded bird that cost the lives of dozens of test pilots and operational personnel before even seeing any real combat. The lesson that visual boldness does not replace mechanical reliability was etched like a scar on the Vought history, serving as a warning to subsequent generations of naval engineers. However, while the Americans dealt with their defective spaceships, the Soviets were about to introduce a solution that promised versatility but would deliver only a logistical and operational nightmare that nearly broke their morale of their fleets.
The conclusion of our journey through the disasters of Cold War. This takes us to the heart of the Soviet obsession with versatility at any cost, where the MiG-23 and Yak-38 embodied the failure of an engineering that bit off more than it could chew. The vision behind the MiG-23 was ambitious, variable geometry wings that were supposed to dominate at both low and high speeds, but incompetence, Russian logistics delivered a maintenance nightmare that spent more time in the hangar than in the air. For a veteran, on the other side, piloting that machine was like operating a Swiss watch made of glass. The complexity was such that any minor failure in the hydraulic systems transformed the jet into an uncontrollable projectile. It's the same trap as an investor who diversifies their portfolio so much in complex assets that they lose the ability to manage basic risk, ultimately seeing their wealth eroded by the very structure that should protect it. From the Kremlin, the Yak-38 was sold as the ultimate answer to the British Harrier, but decision, using 3 different engines for vertical takeoff, was a miscalculation bordering on technical absurdity. The great secret, what was shameful about the Forger, was that on hot days, the engines consumed so much fuel to take off that the plane barely had enough range to reach the horizon, becoming nothing more than an ornament, armored and useless on the decks of the Kiev-class aircraft carriers. To understand the gravity of this design flaw, imagine buying an extremely expensive management software that demands so much computer memory that it crashes before you even open the first report. The tool negates its own purpose. I recommend studying the law of diminishing returns in engineering, as the Yak-38 is the perfect example of how adding complexity can in fact destroy the usefulness of a combat system. The final feeling when looking at these 2 projects is that survival in combat became a footnote in the face of the need to project an image of technological parity with the West.
The MiG-23, with its humiliating combat record, and the Yak-38, with its automatic ejection that fired without warning, left a trail of frustration and distrust that marked the end of an era of unbridled experimentation. Seeing these machines relegated to museums or turned into scrap metal is a silent reminder that technical arrogance, when detached from operational reality, is the fastest path to obsolescence. But before we close this chapter and understand how these mistakes shaped the modern world, we need to look at the wounds that never healed and the men who paid the price for each of these wrong decisions. Now that we've exposed the inner workings of this era of incompetence and reckless daring, the question that remains for you is not about airplanes, but about your own trajectory. How many times are you ignoring the signs of a failure imminent in your life or business just to maintain an appearance of speed and success? What are these projects of Cold War teaching us is that the truest strategy requires the courage to stop, review the foundation, and prioritize the survival of the long term, instead of the fleeting brilliance of a poorly planned innovation. I ask you, will you continue operating like one of those doomed jets waiting for the impact, or will you take the decision to be the master of your own personal engineering today? The knowledge you've gained here shouldn't just be a historical curiosity, but a trigger for you to question every structure that appears solid but inside is about to collapse. Don't let your story be written by mistakes that could have been avoided with a little more humility and vision. If you felt the weight of this reality and want to continue deciphering the secrets that the system tries to hide, its place is here with us. Subscribe to the channel and activate notifications right now. Don't let the next lesson of a veteran go unnoticed while you fly blind. The world is full of traps disguised as progress, and I'm here to make sure you have the sharp radar to avoid each one. Until the next mission.